In April 2022, North Korea held one of the largest military parades in its history. And the star of the show was the Hwasong-17. This huge intercontinental ballistic missile is capable of carrying several nuclear warheads and of striking anywhere on Earth. For Kim Jong-un, this missile is the life insurance policy that he wanted to solemnly present the entire world. The United States and the other enemies of the regime have been warned. The Kim dynasty can henceforth inflict very serious harm on them. Every 1st of January in Pyongyang, a long procession heads towards Mansu Hill in the heart of the Korean capital. Braving the freezing cold, the people come to wish Happy New Year to Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, the eternal leaders of Korea. But on the 1st of January 2018, Kim Jong-un, the most recent of the Kims, and the son and grandson of the massive Mansudae statues, sent a special message to his people. Yet, this message was addressed far beyond a North Korean audience. On that day, it was addressed to the United States and to the whole world as well.
The United States will never dare to declare war on us. All of America is now within the range of our nuclear missiles. The nuclear button is on my office desk. This is not merely a threat, it is reality. At the end of 2017, Kim Jong-un announced that the North Korean nuclear program was finally completed. A month later, in his New Year's speech, he reaffirmed this and stated that he had fulfilled the testament of his predecessors.
On that day, Kim Jong-un announced that his country had achieved its ultimate goal. It had become a nuclear power. And this meant it was now a practically unattackable power, even by the United States. Kim Jong-un also explained that the North Korean nuclear program was not particularly recent. It had been conceived by his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, the founder of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the 1930s, Kim Il-sung was a militant Korean nationalist who fought against Japanese colonization. He was initially trained by the Chinese Communist Party, and then in the Soviet Union, where he was a refugee for part of the Second World War. In 1945, when Japan surrendered and Korea recovered its sovereignty, he was 33 years old. After a long struggle, Japan's capitulation was only made possible by the first use of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Kim Il-sung had a front row seat from which to witness the interest in this new weapon.
The case of Japan, by the way, was also relatively important for the nuclear program, because we know that Japan was ultimately forced to surrender by the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945. And for the Koreans, this experience of this overpowering colonial power, which they ultimately didn't have much to oppose by just 2 bombs, that's how it turned out, ultimately brought them to their knees, and from that, they also drew the conclusion that nuclear weapons were important.
After Hiroshima, the Japanese, who were colonizing the Korean peninsula, surrendered and returned to Japan. Soviet troops then occupied the north of the country as far south as the 38th parallel. Further south, the Americans formed the occupying force. Korea had not been independent since the end of the 19th century. As was the case in Germany, these zones of occupation would eventually result in the division of the country. In 1948, the Soviet Union installed Kim Il-sung in the north after a plebiscite. Washington then set up a puppet government in the south. 2 years later, in 1950, the young North Korean leader crossed the 38th parallel and reunited the country by force. This was the beginning of the Korean War. Many historians see the Korean War as the fiercest war of the 20th century. Nearly 5 million people died on the small peninsula. Nothing seemed able to curb the rage of the fighters. General MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations forces in South Korea, wanted to use nuclear weapons. Here again, Kim Il-sung saw the strategic importance of the bomb.
The North Korean nuclear problem is not recent. It began long before the collapse of the Soviet Union. North Korea had always wanted to develop its own nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had even attempted to dissuade them from doing so.
From then on, the bomb became an obsession with the regime. North Korea had 2 protectors, China and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had detonated its first bomb in 1949. Kim Il-sung did everything in his power to obtain nuclear secrets from these 2 great communist powers.
Under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, North Korea maintained good relations with both superpowers, China and the USSR. One day it was close to Beijing, and the next day it was close to Moscow. North Korea is a very small country, but it profited by taking advantage of the rivalry between these 2 superpowers.
In 1963, the Soviet Union gave North Korea its first nuclear reactor. This small research reactor was installed at the Nyangbyon Research Center in the mountains in the middle of the country.
North Korea has already been dealing with a nuclear program since at least the 70s or the 60s. I myself, also from my personal experience, can confirm that my father was a nuclear physicist. We lived in Russia in the 70s, where there's a nuclear research center, and at that time North Korean scientists were already working there.
Certainly, they were aware of that very early on in North Korea. But the first cooperation with the Soviet Union in the 1950s was mainly in the context of a research reactor, which was certainly not yet equipped, even in terms of capacity utilization and equipment, to produce nuclear weapons, to produce plutonium, to ultimately be able to produce nuclear weapons.
Over the years, American spies continued to observe the development of the Yongbyon site. It was impressive, but it did not really worry the international community. North Korea was not yet a rogue state. Within communist spheres, Pyongyang was an example of rapid development. Kim Il-sung was a respected leader who lavishly received other leaders from around the entire world. North Korea remained open. This small country in East Asia preferred to charm rather than to frighten. The founder of the Kim dynasty often received official guests in Pyongyang, and Kim Il-sung would also visit allied countries, notably East Germany, as well as Ceausescu's Romania. They were his two closest allies in the Soviet sphere. But everything changed in the late 1980s. The Kim regime started losing its supporters. Kim Il-sung watched with horror the death of the Ceausescus. They had ruled Romania for more than 30 years, using methods similar to those used by the Kims. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc cut Pyongyang off from the rest of the world.
Yes, the death of Ceausescu was in the fall of 1989, I think. In December, that was. It sent quite a dramatic signal for the North Korean leadership. And I think it's also one of the reasons why they decided so vehemently against a reform course.
The Soviet Union was a patron of North Korea, provided a lot of material assistance, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was gone. And you add that up with the willingness of China to have diplomatic relations with South Korea. They felt isolated, betrayed, and they felt they had to take their security into their own hands, and they began to pursue in earnest this nuclear weapons program.
The only solution for the Kim regime was to accelerate its nuclear program. This time, the expansion of the Yongbyon site seriously worried the international community. Under pressure, North Korea finally accepted the International Atomic Energy Agency's first inspection in 1992. The West hoped to force North Korea to stop their race for the bomb.
Hans Blix was the head of the delegation. He took the IAEA specialist to Pyongyang via Beijing. The delegation inspected Yongbyon, but it was the first time that foreigners had been allowed to visit the infamous site of Yongbyon.
North Korea tried to conceal its plutonium production program, but this time, the international community could no longer close its eyes.
Full inspection was not accepted at the radiochemical laboratory in accordance with the agreement we had. As a result, we cannot exclude that this radiochemical plant, reprocessing plant, has been operated between February last year and this year. We are not saying that it has been, but we cannot exclude that it has been operated.
The American President Bill Clinton went to the border between the two Koreas and openly threatened Pyongyang.
it's pointless for them to try to develop nuclear weapons, because if they ever use them, it would be the end of their country.
If the Kim regime continued its nuclear military development, then Washington would use force.
We believed that was a place to stop them before they made the 6 nuclear bombs. And so as Secretary of Defense at the time, I made a public statement that we would not permit North Korea to reprocess that fuel to make the nuclear bombs. We were prepared to take some form of military action to keep that from happening. At that time, North Korean press referred to me as a war maniac.
As a result, the first denuclearization treaty was signed with North Korea. This was in 1994. And the United States believed that it had eliminated the Kim threat.
I was involved in this from the early 90s to the present, and I look back at a number of critical points. The United States and North Korea had agreed in 1994 to something called the Agreed Framework, and that kind of put a lid, a cap, on their program, especially no more production of plutonium for weapons. And that was working pretty well.
So, what did North Korea do? It found another clandestine way of developing its nuclear program. Abdul Qadir Khan, a Pakistani engineer, had developed a technology to produce highly enriched uranium. Pakistan offered this technology to Kim Il-sung in exchange for long and medium-range missiles. Kim Il-sung had negotiated a treaty of non-proliferation with the United States while actively pursuing a secret nuclear program.
The U.S. decided to stop negotiating with Pyongyang, but it asked Beijing, North Korea's closest ally, to put pressure on the Kim regime.
In the past, China was helpful in dealing with North Korea. Our assumption was that China shared the U.S. view that North Korea should not have nuclear weapons, and there should not be instability on the Korean peninsula. And because of this assumed shared interest between the U.S. and China, the two countries worked well together on North Korea. During the 2000s, the so-called six-party talks.
After several attempts, these six-party talks failed, as had all other negotiations. North Korea had no intention of abandoning its nuclear program, and Pyongyang did not always listen to its Chinese ally.
From the Chinese point of view, North Korea is really a very, very difficult partner, and in itself also a certain problem. The armament of the countries around North Korea, Japan, South Korea, and of course also the presence of the USA in the region, is always justified with the threat of North Korea, whereby it is relatively clear that the whole thing is actually, or at least also, directed against China.
North Korean leaders obviously went to Beijing regularly. Officially, the communist parties of the two countries were considered sister parties. Cordial relations had been maintained by every generation of the Kims. But this was first and foremost a necessity for both countries. Since the fall of the Soviet bloc, North Korea had only China left to fall back on.
Contrary to what one might think, China cannot control North Korea. There's a Chinese proverb that says, without lips, our teeth would get cold. China would be in trouble without North Korea, and so North Korea enjoys a large autonomy with regards to Beijing.
China sent rice. It was thought that the people of North Korea were going to starve to death. It allowed North Korea to remain alive. For China, Korea is a buffer zone against the rest of the world.
To understand the importance of North Korea for China, we must consider Beijing's attitude to all its neighbors. In Mandarin, China is called the Middle Kingdom, and as such, it requires buffer zones all around it. These surrounding countries are more or less vassalized and protect the heart of the country. Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang are strategic points for the Chinese regime. China attempts to control them by keeping their enemies away from their borders. And this strategy requires that Xi Jinping supports his turbulent Korean neighbor. North Korea is the country that has suffered the most economic sanctions from the UN, particularly since 2006, the year of its first nuclear test. The same sanctions voted by China at the Security Council virtually ban all and any trade with Pyongyang, but when it comes to applying them, Beijing prefers to turn a blind eye.
North Korea has launched 2 satellites since Kim Jong-un came to power, the first in 2012 and another in 2013. International sanctions were adopted and China seemed cooperative. But in reality, 3 or 6 months later, it could be seen that the sanctions were not actually being applied between the 2 countries. If a solid triangular alignment between China, Russia, and North Korea against the United States were ever instigated, then it would provide a complementary survival zone for Pyongyang. Isn't that right? For a country as small as North Korea, its 2 huge neighbors, China and Russia, could provide the much-desired leeway to survive. The UN Security Council restrictions and the American sanctions would then no longer have any effect. Consequently, North Korea could easily become a nuclear power on the international scene.
China has thus decided to tolerate the misconduct of its unruly neighbor in order to better hold its designated enemy, the United States of America, at bay. In order to guard the security of South Korea, the American Army still has 30,000 troops stationed south of the 38th parallel, which divides the 2 Koreas. If North Korea were to collapse, then the GIs would be in direct contact with the Chinese border, a situation that Beijing wishes to avoid at all costs.
Government statement of the DPRK. It is the U.S. that disturbs peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and leads the situation to a dangerous state today. The Bush administration has designated our country as a target of preemptive nuclear attack, which means
Pyongyang also cultivates an American obsession. Every day, the regime's propaganda vilifies Washington.
If the U.S. triggers off a war on this land, our army and people will destroy the land of the U.S. and utterly eliminate.
The Kims are persuaded that America is the only power that threatens their dictatorship. And they continuously brandish this presumed American threat in order to unify the population in a patriotic reflex.
That is the way Korea responds. The aggressors will never avoid death.
북은 기본적으로 미국을 가장 큰 그 위협 세력으로
North Korea considers the United States to be its most serious threat in the world.
미국과 전쟁을 치러서
Their propaganda continues to claim that they won the war against the United States during the 1950-1953 Korean War.
그리고 가장 미국에 대해서
And North Korea continued its provocative aggression, sometimes even militarily, against Washington.
미국과 관계 개선을 통해서
In spite of all of this, North Korea has not forgotten its ultimate goal: to establish diplomatic relations with Washington and sign a peace treaty.
추구해 왔다고 생각을 합니다.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
In January 2017, Donald Trump became the 45th President of the United States of America.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
This president, unlike all preceding presidents, initially appeared ready to fulfill Pyongyang's dreams of restored diplomatic relations. Yet, the relationship between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un got off to a bad start.
We begin with North Korea late today launching a new missile.
North Korea has announced it successfully tested a nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile.
A capability the world hoped North Korea would never reach.
A triumphant North Korea says its latest ballistic missile test demonstrates that it now has the capability to strike anywhere in the United States.
In July 2017, North Korea tested a new intercontinental ballistic missile. This missile was theoretically capable of striking the American continent.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. Now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
In September 2017, the UN General Assembly was shocked by the new American president's speech. The response was brutal.
The nuclear button is on my office desk. This is not merely a threat, it is reality.
Kim Jong-un is only a small leader of a small country. Opposite him is the president of the most powerful country in the world. The most powerful man in the world threatened this small dictator and started a strange verbal war. It should have been an easy victory for Donald Trump, but that was not at all the case.
They respect neither their own citizens nor...
As his predecessors, Donald Trump had to deal with the provocations of North Korea. But he decided to do it in a totally different manner.
Then evil will triumph.
And despite the unanimous opposition of his advisors, he decided to meet with Kim Jong-un. A few months later, the two men met in Singapore.
This is a leader who really is an unknown personality. People don't know much about him. I think that he's going to surprise on the upside. But I've said it many times, who knows? You know, the way they say that you know if you're going to like somebody in the first 5 seconds? Well, I think that very quickly I'll know whether or not something good is going to happen.
In the United States, the mere fact that President Trump spoke with Kim Jong-un on equal terms was considered a generous diplomatic gesture. But if such a position was upheld, then the nuclear question would never be resolved.
It was a historical meeting, in the apotheosis of the Kim dynasty's efforts.
Would you like to say something to the press?
Today is an historical moment. We are signing a treaty that buries our difficult past and that announces a new start.
Thank you very much.
But the results of this summit were mostly symbolic.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic.
In spite of all the smiles, the two leaders signed a declaration of intent which had no practical significance. The real negotiations began in Vietnam at a second meeting that took place in Hanoi a few months later. But this time, Kim Jong-un had decided to play his trump card.
Kim Jong-un made a proposal. It was a one-sided proposal. It was to close down the facility at Yanbian, close that down in exchange for the removal of all important U.S. sanctions. It was one-sided, and the Trump administration correctly rejected it. I think if the Trump administration had countered with a realistic proposal, maybe we could have made some progress. But Kim Jong-un left Hanoi humiliated, embarrassed. He was advised that the Americans would accept his proposal, but they rejected it out of hand. And since Hanoi, which was in 2019, there have been no productive engagement. And in fact, the North has refused every U.S. effort to try to engage with the North.
North Korea, convinced that no agreement was possible with the West, withdrew into its own shell. The Hermit Kingdom was isolated from the rest of the world by the demilitarized zone that separated it from South Korea. Near the 38th parallel, this hermetic zone has been made impassable since 1953. It was a no man's land, empty, except for the patrols of the opposing armies. They watched and waited, and sometimes fired a few stray shots. It is the last remains of the Cold War. In some places, observation posts allowed the South Koreans to peer at their enemies in the north. But there was not much to be seen, except for a few Potemkin villages. For it's beyond these mountains that Pyongyang hides its arsenal. And thousands of missiles are pointed southwards towards Seoul, only about 30 kilometers away. The Seoul capital area has 25 million inhabitants, and once a month, the population prepares against an attack from the north. Here, the subway stations also serve as shelters. They stock emergency rations as well as gas masks in the case of a chemical attack. Long before becoming a nuclear power, North Korea had already used the threat of destroying Seoul as its first line of defense.
Even before it had an active nuclear weapons program, it had 10,000 artillery tubes within range of Seoul. So if there were ever efforts to intervene military to stop their program, they would be in a position to cause massive death and destruction in Seoul. And so they've been relentless. They've been single-minded in pursuing this policy.
Faced with this threat, South Korea often hesitated between two strategies. The first strategy is a firm and total alignment with the United States. The South Korean army and the American troops regularly demonstrate their military strength. These well-publicized exercises are intended to demonstrate America's determination to defend South Korea at any cost. But does this conventional strategy still have any validity now that North Korea has become an atomic power?
And now that North Korea has completed the development of intercontinental missiles, what is it going to do next? They're going to ask themselves if Washington is really going to sacrifice New York in order to save Seoul. As of 2022, North Korea has simulated attacks against the General Staff Headquarters, the airports, and seaports in South Korea. And a law has legalized the preemptive use of nuclear weapons. All this demonstrates that North Korea has adopted a more and more aggressive nuclear doctrine. If the problem of North Korea remains unsolved and the nuclear threat increases, then South Korea will also want to develop its own nuclear arsenal. Then Japan and Taiwan will want them next, and so on. And all of East Asia will be caught in a deadly game of nuclear dominoes. It was something that the Americans had to seriously take into consideration.
South Korea's second strategy is to attempt a reconciliation with North Korea. In 2000, Kim Jong-il met with Kim Dae-jung for the first time. Kim Dae-jung, a member of the Democratic Party, was the first president of South Korea to be elected from the left of the political spectrum. Since then, every president from the left has attempted reconciliation with the Kim dynasty. The last episode in these North-South summits began at the 2018 Olympic Games at Pyeongchang in South Korea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of the Republic of Korea, Moon Jae-in.
For the first time, athletes from the two countries paraded together under a common flag.
And an important moment in Olympic history as the North and South Korean athletes enter as one team under the flag of the Korean Peninsula.
And for the first time also, a member of the Kim dynasty crossed the 38th parallel. Kim Yo-jong attended the Games. She is the North Korean dictator's younger sister and the de facto Minister of Foreign Affairs. And she successfully charmed the South Korean public opinion.
Kim Yo-jong is number 2 in the regime. This is rather new for North Korea. Before, Kim Il-sung was number 1 and Kim Jong-il was number 2. The relationship was vertical. But this changed under Kim Jong-un. The new power structure is between siblings. If anything were to happen to Kim Jong-un, then Kim Yo-jong would replace him and assume his role.
After the Olympics, a summit was organized between Kim Jong-un and the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in. This meeting took place in the DMZ, and the concrete barrier demarking the border was symbolically crossed. The atmosphere was open and relaxed, and Kim Jong-un revealed to the South Korean press that he had a certain sense of humor, as well as a Confucian respect for his elder, the president of South Korea. Never in the history of the two Koreas had a rapprochement seemed so close. Nevertheless, it was but a flash in the pan.
I think North Korea has already looked very closely at how the relationship has gone between East and West Germany as well. and they're perfectly aware that as long as North Korea is economically weaker than South Korea is always a big threat. So the North Korean strategy towards South Korea is to first of all build something like a balance. In the military field, you have that, especially through the nuclear weapons, with a lot of investment. In the economic sphere, not yet at all.
Our adored comrade Kim Jong-un personally directed the test launch of the new intercontinental ballistic missile, the great military force of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Every day, the television in Pyongyang recounts the history of this small country that aspires to equality with the major world powers. North Korea has spent up to 25% of its GDP in order to acquire a nuclear arsenal. And since then, its obsession is turned towards intercontinental ballistic missiles. Every night, the television news airs increasingly innovative dramatizations. The great leader is at work, sometimes as the commanding general, sometimes in the role of top gun.
The ultimate goal of North Korea is to obtain a good standard of living, to develop their economy, to become powerful, and to provide a good system of social protection. The nuclear option is the only way to achieve this. It's a race against time. They believe that if they hold out a little longer, then their system will no longer be threatened.
The longer we wait, the more North Korean nuclear weapons there will be, and the harder it will be to negotiate with the North Koreans. As their economy is unstable and their political regime is not strong, it's often considered that time is playing against North Korea. But look at what happened over the past 30 years. Is time really playing in our favor? The North Korean regime has not collapsed, and their nuclear capacity has progressively increased. And international sanctions are less and less effective. So, time is not playing in favor of the West. It appears to be more favorable for North Korea.
The state television broadcasts always end in the same way. The launching of the missile is a great success. America and her allies have been warned.
Comrade Kim Jong-un affirmed that the strategic forces of the DPRK are fully ready to thoroughly curb and contain any dangerous military attempts of the US imperialists.
Kim Jong-un now knows that he has the means of guaranteeing his security vis-à-vis the rest of the world. The dictator has not forgotten that his plans to maintain the Kim dynasty in power rest on two priorities: nuclear weapons and economic development. Therefore, the state propaganda broadcasts long scenes of enthusiastic civilian crowds and soldiers cheering the great leader. Henceforth, the danger can only come from his own population.